Since the first slave master sector had been completely taken over, many of the species that was there tried to barter for its own release. Many of them offered to return slaves. We simply told them, well, you will return the slaves or we're going to indiscriminately start dropping nuclear warheads on your planet. We sent them a video, a fake video that was, of one of our warheads dropping onto an uninhabited place on their planet and just annihilating everything. It was a bluff, sort of. We were willing to take out their planet, of course, but the destruction of an entire species, especially their home planet, especially when we understood how delicate that was, as we still did not have our home planet in one piece anymore. We emphasized enough of this. The empathy we had for this one act was enough to hold our hand at least for a while. Many of their ships would show up and simply ask to be returned to their own families, which we agreed, with the conditions. The two conditions were that they must return all their slaves, free them, and bring them to us. And two, they must abandon their ships in orbit. If they choose to, they can simply send their ships into the nearest star. However, they would not have their ships, as they would be taken over by us. Many of their captains who had agreed to go back to their families or bring their crew to their families did in fact drop off their own kin and leave the ship itself so that we could attach our own boarding parties and get the slaves off. After that, we knew there was a countdown timer. The automated system would simply turn the engines on and send it straight into the star. We didn't have much interest in collecting any of these ships because we already knew them. Stem to stern, every single bolt was downloaded. We knew exactly how they were made, and we knew that there was nothing we could gain from them. So we simply let the ships go. I know it seems like a simple loss of materials, but we were collecting so many materials still, even months after the battle, that it didn't really matter. Most everyone was becoming very, very wealthy. Many personnel who owned their own ship, similar to mine but not totally, were becoming very wealthy and had a lot of crew, most of which for personal reasons. These were the type of captains I kept on a list, along with the name of their ships, and we would not do business with them. In one instance, one of them came on board and tried to swap out a couple of his harem and wanted a half a dozen of my crew. Very quickly, before I even turned around, weapons were drawn and he was told to leave the ship. But he would have to leave his so-called harem. Apparently, the desire to have power over others does not just extend to aliens, but it is still something that is in humans. We sent the message to the human fleets, and they immediately fell on this ship. It was one of only a few, thankfully, but they did come across the ship, search it, and check with the crew on board, and turned out that they were being held as not really slaves, but more as indentured servants in some way. Debt slavery is what we used to call it. I really hated that. I even offered to let my crew have at the captain and a few of his own crew. But we were told to back off. It is the way of things now. The crew and themselves, along with the captain, were imprisoned on a Martian penal colony. No way of escaping, as there was nothing but almost vacuum in any direction. The air was getting thicker, mind you, but it was still too thin to make a run for it, and you'd die of suffocation before you got 4 miles out. Though we had our own problems, they were very minor. Most everyone still stuck with what they did, what they knew, and what they knew was collecting resources, different type of organic and non-organic matter to buy, sell, and trade with. In some cases, our own crews would go out with their recovery craft and pick up very, very, very large chunks of rock that were floating around, many times from the Oort cloud or from the asteroid belt or from any other type of asteroid belt. And in one case, they were able to snag an entire meteor that was heading straight for the Sol sector. The damn rock was about twice the size of my ship, and I gave them a lot of props for being able to even slow this thing down, let alone stop it. With that alone, we were able to purchase whatever the hell we wanted. Our fabricator had already created everything we wanted, though as it turns out, we would have to create a whole nother sector. Even though we had our own nursery, as it turns out, as the crew started to get more and more freedom, they started to experiment. And because of that, many relationships started out, being that this is a colony ship, that is to be expected. Several fights started, but when they started out in earnest, breaking out in places like the chow hall or the recreation area, I simply had a fabricator create an octagon along with the associated pads, mouth guards, and whatever else we needed, and told them if they needed to settle anything, they would settle it in the octagon, and that's all. They would not start fighting outside, or they will be facing me. They realized how dangerous that would be, as a human was definitely stronger than they were, and a lot tougher than they were as well. They were genetically designed for aesthetics, not for practicality, which they understood this very, very well. Even though we had to deal with small issues like that, our larger issue was the fact that I was requested, and I'll put that in quotes, requested, to bring in a crew of doctors so they could check out my crew, as they wanted to know more about the processes that created them. I didn't have much of a problem with this. We had a top-notch medical facility where we were. I simply demanded, and yes, I did demand, that they would give me the most updated specs for medical technology that they had. Unfortunately for us, that only upgraded one machine, and not by much, but it was still enough. That one was the, well, the rebuilder, if you want to call it. You put it in there and you can reattach someone's arm, leg, or whatever other appendage in a matter of a few minutes. And now with the upgrade, it takes less than a minute to rebuild an entire arm. It's incredible, this technology, which is what makes us be able to live out here in the stars without incredible degradation to our bodies. The crew that came on board were pretty professional. While they did their research, they were required to teach classes on advanced medical techniques to the entire crew, as long as they got to a certain level of knowledge, that is. Some of the crew we had just received, so of course it was going to take a while before they got to that level. However, things seemed to be progressing well, although I do have to say I know a honey trap when I see one. Two of the female researchers that came on board were far too young. I checked their own medical records, and their records were very sparse, which was a huge red flag for me. As it turns out, they wanted to get close to me to find out what my ideals were with the crew, what I had planned, and if I planned on reproducing with any of them, things of that nature. Also, they had this weird thing about wanting my DNA, which I told them to straight up fuck off. Later on, as we were finishing up their tour, I did find that it was nice to have a few humans around. We could talk more in a human dialect than anything else. The demonoids were fun to talk with and all, but the issue was they all saw me as their godfather, their uncle, their old wise relative. They didn't look at me in any other way. It was nice to have people that were not family that I could talk to, try to make friends with, which was pleasant, of course. What the researchers found incredibly pleasant was the fact that we took great care in bringing all sorts of actual foodstuffs up. Our seed vault was almost completely full. We had animals on board. We had our own insect hives that we need for pollination. We had everything we needed to make sure that we did not rely on anyone and anything. One of the researchers, the lead researcher actually, told me that he had saw several ships of similar design being made. As it turns out, the way I had designed it was that with a lot of advice from others. Putting everything together, we had found up with the absolute peak of efficiency. It was crazy. I love the fact that my ship was basically the first one off the line. Maybe it'll be a new class, who knows? Later on, as they were about to leave, I noticed that one of the researchers was getting a little close to one of my crew members. I wondered if she was really smitten with the guy or what, but eventually he asked if he could leave and join their research team. I simply told him, "You're free to come and go if you want. You're not restricted here. You're not a slave to this ship. You're a crew member. All you do is put in your resignation, and I'll sign it so that it's filed away, and you're free to live your life any way you choose." I made sure that the entire crew knew about this, as many of them seemed to be getting a little stir crazy being stuck on one ship, even as massive as it was. It wasn't long before they were looking into the possibility of leaving out of the ship and going into the larger universe. I only know this because the ship AI was watching all of it, and he reported to me. Or she. You know what? I'm not even going to say it. I'll say it. It reported to me and told me that things were being searched. More things were being searched on the galactic net that showed that they were more interested in stretching out beyond their own population, which is perfectly fine as we hadn't found a suitable planet yet. Many of the groups that had gone out into the planet at large were doing so mainly as a liberation force. They weren't actually doing this as a colonization team. I wondered if it would be best if we simply jumped into an unknown sector, but then again, this is a colony ship. We can't face a battle group. If we do, we're in some seriously deep shit. With that, I let the crew do as they wish. Several of them left. It came out to only about 4%, actually 3.9% if you want to get specific, decided that they wanted to leave and pursue things elsewhere. I simply reminded them that they're going to be on another ship with other species, and they need to really be careful what they do and what they say, and for the love of God, will they put on some more clothes. I put up with that just because that is what they knew. That is part of their culture now. Interesting to look at, but seriously, they're going to get in trouble. While all this was going on, more and more of the first slave master species had started to break away from their own people. They had started to lock into their own colonies, which, of course, other colonies, multiple colonies in the same sectors, or other sectors would end up fighting against each other. They decided to fight for more dominance among each other, and this was the main fault of those who want dominance over other species. When they can't do it anymore, they want dominance over each other. And to do that, they will sacrifice so many. I wasn't there when the first of the human groups finally jumped into the next sector. They jumped into a firefight. They sat there on the edge of the sector and watched two of these alien fleets tear each other apart. And as they did, they saw something strange. They wanted to stay silent, hiding behind one of the planets, making sure they could swoop in when the fighting was already finished. Why waste your own materials when the enemy's going to do it for you? But there was something else. They couldn't see what it was. And just as the fighting had ended, we saw another group. This was a different slave master fleet. We recognized them. These were going to be the other slave masters that we were going to attack before. I'll just call them the number twos. Because those little shits came in blasting. They took everyone. They actually tried to take the planet. We saw all sorts of transports head to the planet, and we could hear their communications. I was on my way there when the fleet that was watching over them decided to send the distress call out. The call wasn't really for people to come and help them, but it was more, we're going to need medical supplies and we're going to need people that know how to use it because they're tearing apart everybody down there. Immediately, I called for everyone to get ready for jump and we started heading there, but it would take us several days, over 80 hours to get there. It was annoying. Unfortunately, the jump engines, though good, can only do so much. It's not like we can jump from one side of the universe to the other. If we could do that, this war would have been over a long time ago. because we would have just gone to home planets, dropped a couple of kiloton or megaton nukes on the poles, and said, fuck around and find out again. I dare you. But that's not how things went. On the way there, I kept getting reports about how the human fleet would have to go in and try to keep the number twos away. Unfortunately, they came at with sheer ferocity. Their ships were not nearly as big, but they were much more agile, and they were able to bounce around and dodge a lot of the ballistic shots. Many times they could dodge torpedoes unless the torpedoes were set out in a strange formation so that they could make sure they actually caught a piece of the alien ship. This was a massive waste of resources, but with the fabricators, who gives a shit? As the human fleet got close, they realized that these number twos were sneaky little turds. And they came at us with such abandonment, and they came from all different sides. I called in that my ship was going to come into the fold, and we bounced into the sector. We were pretty far away from the fighting, and I could see in the long-range radar. Most of my crew was already getting ready into their fighters, but it would take several more hours of sub-FTL to actually get there. You couldn't just jump. It was an unknown sector, and we had no idea where the extra gravity wells were going to be. And the last thing I needed was this ship to be torn in half because I did something stupid. So we moved in very slowly. As I watched, these number twos would kind of use FTL to jump in from different sectors. Though they could not outfight the human fleet, they seemed to just want to hurt us. Even if they got one shot that put a hole inside the side of a dreadnought, even if that was enough, it seemed to make them happy and seemed to make others try to drive towards this dreadnought to try and make that hole much bigger, much larger, much deeper, and they tried to insert anything into there. It didn't matter if it was a torpedo, a missile, or the whole ship, just so they could get a piece of it. I wondered what was driving them to such lengths, but I didn't have time to find out. As we were going closer, I realized that the number 2 fleet had simply retreated. They flipped and burned and then jumped to FTL as soon as they could. They didn't even retrieve their people on the surface. By the time I got to the 5th planet, which is where this was all happening, the battle was over. Our own folks had dropped in on drop pods and simply cleaned it up. I simply sat there and waited to see if there were any more demonoids that I was going to pick up. Unfortunately, what I saw chilled me to the bone. The number 2 slave masters, when they realized that they could not take the slaves and their transports weren't coming, they killed everyone. Just lined them up, and a blast of the back of the head or the back of the spine, whatever it took to take them down. An unholy slaughter was laying down there, and we were watching the video, and I could actually hear some of the men on the ground just cursing in that low breath that you hear soldiers say as they are barely able to keep it together. Off to the side, I could hear the sounds of somebody dropping to their knees. As the camera spun, one of the men pulled his helmet off and puked all over the ground. The air was clearly good enough to breathe, but usually you keep your brain bucket on so you don't get your head blown off. Not exactly something we can rebuild. But what they saw was a bunch of young ones. Different species, of course, but young ones that they had dropped an explosive next to, and there was nothing but parts everywhere. A stray head here, a stray arm there, the occasional leg. This was enough to light a fire under everyone's ass as they saw the video, which was shared to everyone who was willing to see it. My crew, many of them too young to watch it, I warned them that this was going to mess them up. Many of them sat there and just shook after they saw what was on the ground. I, being as stoic as possible, simply went up and took their devices away so that they could be comforted and to relax and let them know that this would not happen as long as they were on my ship. I would protect them at all costs. I hovered around that planet, at about twice lunar orbit, waiting for any call for survivors, anything. I kept getting requests for resupply from different areas, which of course we obliged. As soon as we could, the ships were launched as soon as they were loaded, and off they went to wherever they needed to go. With this, the fleet, the wolf pack, was starting to get hungry again. The wolf was drooling, and the wolves wanted blood once again. We didn't know much about the number 2. The number 2s, as we could figure out, were more scavengers than anything else. They liked to ambush. They never liked being in a straight-up fight. And because they ambushed, and they ambushed very well from what we understood, this is what got them to where they were as far as in galactic standing. They would come in on FTL on small ships, small enough that cannot be targeted very well by the turrets, and then they would fire their main guns and then jump to FTL again before the rounds even hit. Then another wave would come in behind them and do the same thing before they could even be hit, and we knew this was going to be a problem. The kicker is they had no idea what human tech was capable of. Many of our battleships and dreadnoughts put out what's known as an interdiction field, as in you can't jump to FTL when you're close enough to them. Now, this field is not as wide as we would like. That being said, it's wide enough. It's wide enough that many of their guided munitions will turn into dumb munitions on the way in, and this is why our dreadnoughts and battleships don't take as many hits as you would think. So we could take a little bit of solace in the fact that they would not be able to pull that same tactic off on many of these ships. But what came out of the ether was something we definitely were not expecting. The original slave masters we had taken, several of their ships came out of FTL but immediately started to drift, many of them venting a whole bunch of atmosphere. One of them, it was just an engine. The front of the ship was gone. It's like the engines had been activated, but the front of the ship had been blown off, and the computer had taken it to its destination and then just stopped. Another one that came in, it looked like it had gone through holy hell. Just as they started getting communications, I was trying to decipher it, and the damn thing exploded. The engines had gone completely critical. The few that remained were begging for help. Begging for help from us. And we sat there and listened as the command got a hold of them. And why should we help you? That was the question. Why? Why should we? Why aren't you just surrendering? As it turns out, the number 2s had realized that the first one's home planet had been taken. And with this, they realized there was no large fleet coming to fight them off. So they started facing off against all the other planets. In desperation, they ran. They grabbed what they could and they ran into the night. Either that or they would simply get torn apart through wave after wave of ambushing fire. They didn't know where the FTL was going to come in. Well, mostly. You have a rough idea, but the exact point is not known until they slow down. This worried us a little. However, our engineers were already trying to fix that. We found out that the number 2s had almost completely taken apart the first one's territory. And I mean all of it. We're talking almost 180 different planets and satellites, to include space stations, by the way. I was just amazed when the reports started coming in. I had to actually pull my head away from the console and disconnect because I was like, okay, something's wrong. I'm going to go to the aid station. I'm going to get this thing checked because I must be getting the wrong numbers. Something's off. Getting checked, everything was fine. I sat back in the command couch, and the rest of my bridge crew was just in awe at what they were seeing. The first ones were now an endangered species. So many had been lost, and not by us. The kicker is, it wasn't just the number 2s. There were others that had found out about this, and they also attacked the first ones. And in desperation again, they ran back to their home planet. And now, here we were, collecting their ships, at least what was left of them, and sending their personnel back down to the planet. But now, we have other slave species, 4 more, that are now stronger than before, each of them fighting for their territory. However, what was strange is that it seems they had a plan for this. Everything was planned out. They weren't fighting each other, at least not that we knew about. You would think that they would fight each other for the best planets, but no, each of them seemed to have their own area, their own line that they did not cross. It was strange to see phase lines just appear on the map. I didn't understand how they could be so cruel and callous, and then I realized, yeah, these are slave species, or enslaving species, so yeah, they do that sort of thing. I worried about this. Unfortunately, we didn't get much in the way of new crew members by all the ships coming in. I had hoped about it, but I was told by the command that eventually this area would most likely become very hot, and that my ship should head back to 2nd, 3rd, or 4th line at least. I told them I would start heading back towards the Chitter planet as I would return a few of their own refugees. The refugees were immediately sent over to my ship and immediately started to work and were so grateful for what we had done. As we got towards Chitter space, I had to pass by Zell space as well, who had started to expand themselves. They had expanded throughout their own sector and into a second one that was more or less uninhabited, but they were terraforming the planets to suit them, which kind of put a smile on my face. Good. They're doing well for each other. That's very good. I didn't have any Zell refugees to drop off. I simply sent a message to Junior and the family. Let them know that I was around and if they needed me to let me know. But I had work to do and didn't have time. Getting into Chitter space, I was told that they would need to bring those to the front lines, to the farthest sector out that they had. I told them it wouldn't be a problem, as my crew was ready to rock and roll as was. Then we headed towards the front. As I got into the last sector, which took another few weeks, something happened. Something that we had been preparing for a long time, but I had prayed. We had been preparing for this, but I prayed it would not happen ever. As we jumped into the sector, we came in just opposite the side of their farthest planet. This one only had 4 planets, though, which was odd, but a welcome sight, as that meant there was not as many things to worry about. Didn't have to worry about extra gravitational fields or planetary bodies coming out of nowhere. It didn't have an asteroid belt at all. It was a pretty low-key area. The only thing that was of interest was the first planet closest to the star. The star didn't seem to have much pull, as the closest planet was almost that of Earth orbit. And it was a very, very, very fertile planet. Nobody wanted to destroy this thing, as it was just covered in biomaterial. Just insane amounts. And when you're talking about a planet that's just a little bit larger than Earth, that is mixed, as in 3/4 of the planet is actually ground and it's not water, and that's almost completely covered in fruit-bearing trees and some sort of funky wheat, yeah, I think people want to get a hold of that pretty hard. The only issue was, it wasn't just the Chitters that wanted this. Something else was around. As I went towards the planet to tell the Chitters that we have their reinforcements, something was coming in. At this point, it was the middle of the night for me, so I was asleep, and jumped awake as I heard, General quarters, all hands, man battle stations. General quarters, all hands, 2 battle stations immediately. We have incoming enemy personnel. General quarters. Oh crap, I was awake then. Even without putting pants on, I just bolted down the hallway. And unfortunately, I started hearing, Vampire. Seal all hatches and doorways to condition Z. Time now. Say again. Vampire, vampire, vampire. Oh, crap. And with that, we got hit from the side, and I got knocked off my feet and cracked my head against the side of the bulkhead. Oh, that did not feel good, but I started running down the hallway as best I could, trying to beat the timing of the bulkheads as they began to seal themselves. The hatch doors were immediately sealed as everyone got into position. I could see others running around. A few of us knocked into each other as we went by as the ship began to maneuver itself so that the torpedo tubes were facing the enemy. Also, as they faced the enemy, that was the heavy part of the ship. The most shielded portion was the front, specifically to deflect enemy incoming ordnance. And before I knew it, I'm reaching the bridge and I see them get ready, and everybody is going absolutely frantic. Yet, it is controlled chaos. Everyone knew exactly what their job was. By the time I had got into the command couch and locked in, the AI was beginning to already brief me on what was going on along with the XO. All the weapon systems had been activated and they were starting to blast the ordnance out of the air. How in the hell did we get caught up in this shit? As it turns out, as we were moving in, the enemy decided to use their FTL in a more almost suicidal manner. They had noticed that my ship, though large, was alone, and they used as a micro FTL jump to get in close, so close that by the time our weapon systems activated, they had ordnance already en route. Damage report. We're clean, sir. That hit just knocked us around. No breaches. Good. Get those fuckers out of my sky. And with that, we went back to the controlled chaos of an actual battleship. Even though this is a colony ship, all the turrets began activating. The AI was in charge of most of the point defense cannons as they were very, very good at it. Yet others ran towards the fighters. Our drones were immediately launched as they darted out of the ventral side of the ship. They ended up flying out as though it was a whole bunch of bees swarming across the entire sky. The enemy must have seen this as they tried to run, but they're not running fast enough. Our medium-range turrets started to open up. Target their engines if you can. If not, just kill the bastards. And with that, those manning the turrets locked on and fired. It only took a few seconds before the rounds got close enough that they started impacting. Many of the ships started to bounce sideways and flipped through space as the kinetic force had sent them flying. Our energy weapons started slicing through their drones like they were nothing. The rest of the torpedoes and missiles that were incoming were easily swatted away. Yet our torpedoes were already en route. It was not a surprise to me that they had brought one or two larger ships. These small ships had to dock with something. They didn't have enough room in them to stay out in space for long periods of time, even with fabricators. They needed to be able to recharge, rearm, and do all the other resupply that's needed. So we found the largest ship. I locked on the torpedoes and I personally gave the order, "Fire!" The torpedoes launched in that direction as the turrets themselves continued to defend the ship. We were starting to get swarmed so much that I didn't have a choice. I sent out the distress call. "Mayday, mayday. We're under assault by enemy forces. Need immediate assistance. Over." I didn't actually have to put that out, as moments later, I saw a Chitter battle group come flying into my sensor range. They came in with all guns blazing. The distress call must have gone out past the sector, as less than a minute later, another group came in. Another Chitter fleet had come in and started ripping these number twos apart, totally mashing them up. And it was another 20 minutes. And guess who showed up? It was the Zell, and they were pissed. Not only were they facing 3 different battle groups and my ship, but by that point our fighters had already been manned and they started to take off. All of them armed with missiles and torpedoes and a whole bunch of energy weapons and turrets, and they started to dart into the enemy fleet. The enemy group tried again to retreat, but they forgot with a ship this size, there's an interdiction field that goes out. They must have been freaking out with the fact that they could not jump to FTL at all. The computers just wouldn't let them. Even if they unhooked all their safety measures, the only thing that would happen is the engine would overload and shut down. Or explode, which a few of them did. The largest ship, that seemed to be its own version of a carrier, even though it seems that the ships would dock on the exterior instead of interior, decided to run for it. It tried to get more distance, but as it did turn away into an off direction, my torpedoes crashed into it, digging deep inside the hull and detonating, and I saw the bastard split in two, with the ass end being blown almost completely away. I laughed, sent a message to the rest of the crew. All right, clean 'em up and head back. And with that, with reckless abandonment, they ripped into the enemy fleet. The battle was over in just a few minutes. From the start to finish, the battle only lasted maybe 35 minutes, if that. I'd have to recheck the records. I commended my crew on such a good job they did, and then I told them to make sure that damage control teams were en route to wherever we had taken a hit. Thankfully, again, they hadn't breached the hull, at least the inner hull, but the outer hull had a big old hole in it. I knew what would happen if the enemy fleet had gotten close. They would have drilled into that and eventually would have busted through to some of the cargo areas. And behind that was at least one of our food procurement areas, i.e. our little hydroponics bay. Once that thing freezes over and everything dies, then we're really in trouble. So I was glad they didn't quite get through. I made sure that the ones that we were supposed to deliver got delivered, and I told them I needed to head back for repairs. They all looked at me, and almost simultaneously, the Chitters and Zells actually asked, "How come you don't have bigger guns? Aren't you human?" I had to laugh, and I explained that this was more of a colony ship, as I had the demonoids on board. They were both interested, as they had very little experience with them, and they sent their own envoys to come over and check everyone out. I let them explore a little bit, go through to see what dexterity they were and what they'd been learning and all this other fun stuff. However, I did keep them away from our foodstuffs, as I know the Chitters have an extreme appetite and would eat everything, including the plants themselves, not just the food. After they had gotten a good look, we had done repairs and started to head back towards the Sol sector. I came with a striking realization. We can't just rely on one ship. I need to either find a colony for these guys, or we need to get a flotilla, not just one ship. And then it hit me like a brick in the nuts. What about that planet that nobody wanted to destroy? I had stopped at that jump and sent a message back to the Chitters and asked them if the demonoids could actually have that planet. Nobody wanted to damage it. It was a jewel. They told me they would get back to me on that, because they had to send that up to the queens, and the queens had to hold a council. This is an entire planet, after all, so it would not be a quick decision. All in all, I headed back to the Sol sector, right where I believed I was safe, and I made sure that the crew was good to go. Our losses were down to 2, and I say losses that in quotes because we didn't actually lose them. One poor guy had to have both legs rebuilt, which he's still walking funny as he's going through rehabilitation. And another one, he got, he's in a coma. He got cranked up real bad. Something hit him. We don't know what. Most likely just some debris, but it sent him flying so much that the G-forces kind of squished him inside his own suit. He's going to recover, but it's just going to take some time. Even with our medical technology, we have limits. I reached out and I asked everyone, you think it would be a good idea to have more than one ship? A lot of the demonoids just looked at me like I was nuts. Why would we do that? We like this ship. Are you going to make a bigger one? I did chuckle at that. I don't think anybody could make a ship any larger. I don't think there's fabricators big enough to do that. If they are, I'm sure they're going to be in use for the next year before there's any openings. And hell, it could almost be a decade before that happens. So I kind of let it go. Unfortunately, we didn't have time to breathe much. Before we knew it, we're getting distress calls from every single sector, everywhere at once. It didn't matter what species we had freed. Their sectors were under assault. It wasn't just the number 2s, but the number 3s as well. They're coming out of the woodwork, and it looks like they want to take him back. As I turned the ship back around, I called in for any reinforcements we could. But unfortunately, they didn't have any to spare. The Venetian fleet said that they would be behind us a little bit, maybe about 6 hours. Can you hold them off till then? I kind of laughed. You bet your ass we can. And as we flew into the night again using the jump system, I tried to push the engines past 100%, but the AI wouldn't let me. And as we got close to the front line, once again, General Quarters, all hands to battle stations.